Welcome to Peace Now. My name is Trudy Quaife. I'm a member of Bethlehem Neighbors for Peace. We're a local organization of friends and neighbors, and we've been advocating for peace and justice for well over a decade. I'm your host today, and I'm joined by Miki Conn. Thanks for being here, Miki.
Thank you.
Let me tell you a little bit about Miki. She grew up in Delmar back in the 50s and the early 60s. She is currently a community worker. She's a poet, a storyteller, an artist, and an educator. This is a really interesting story she's going to tell us today, and her mom actually wrote a book about it, which is called Integrating Delmar, The Story of a Friendship. Miki was a member of the first black family to move to Delmar back in 1958. So could we start out, maybe you could tell us a little bit about what you remember about that move, Miki?
Sure. 1957, actually, not 1958, but we had been living in Alaska. My father transferred to a job in Albany, New York, and their hunt for housing began. They had pretty clear ideas about what they wanted in terms of a community with a good education. My sister and I had our input that we wanted a backyard with a climbing tree and lots of grass. So they had their marching orders and began the search. And the book is about the search as well as what happened after they did find housing. They found housing with Arlen Westbrook and her husband. And during that time, Arlen and my mother kept separate journals of their experiences. And they discovered at some point down the road that they had kept these journals and decided that they would compare notes and perhaps publish something about the experience, because it is a historic experience. And so that really is what the book is about and how it came to be. And my role, they were both much older when they decided to do this, so my job was to take these manuscripts, these notes, and put them on the computer, edit them, get them together in some sensible way, and we self-published the book.
Okay, well, the book was published in 2011.
That's right.
And there was a review in the Times-Union, and the title of the review was Stirring Up a Storm in Delmar. And here's a quote from the review. When Arlen Westbrook and her husband rented their modest ranch house on Herrick Avenue in Delmar in 1957 to the Cunningham family, their neighbors in the affluent bedroom community were aghast. The hubbub in the suburb was not because Dr. James Cunningham was a physician who had taken a new job with the state health department, or because his wife Margaret was an artist and a musician, or that their daughters, Miki 12 and Fern 8, were smart and well-behaved. The Cunninghams were black and Delmar was lily white at the time.
Yeah.
So that's how it started.
That's how it started. Living in Alaska, race had not been an issue. And so I think my parents were aware of the fact that race can be and was an issue in many communities in the states. Alaska was not a state at that time. But they had no idea what an ordeal it was going to be, searching for the kind of housing that they wanted. They were constantly directed to ghetto housing, housing that you would not want anyone to live in, and were treated poorly whenever they looked at the kind of housing that they hoped to have. So it was a painful ordeal, but they were two very determined people who had a very clear idea of what they wanted. And with the support of some other friends, they were steered to the Westbrooks, and that worked out.
So your family rented a house in Delmar, And at the same time, you rented from Arlen Westbrook, the co-author of the book, and she couldn't leave right away.
Right.
So you ended up living together in that house.
Yes.
Now, what was the reaction of the people in the neighborhood?
Well, people were very well behaved in the sense that, unlike in some communities, there were not crosses burned on our front lawn or anything like that, but people did try to talk to Arlen and urge her not to do this or not to continue, or that this was not a good idea. Some people were curious. What was it like living with black people, Negroes as it was called then. And then for my parents, they, not so much my father who went to work every day, but my mother, getting to know people was a little difficult and awkward. Getting to know whether people wanted to know you for yourself or for some ulterior motive. So it was not the kind of neighborhood, or the reception did not make it the kind of neighborhood where they felt at ease and comfortable in. But they did feel at ease with each other. That my mother and Arlen discovered that they had many things in common, many interests in common, and their personalities were such that it clicked. A situation that would have been difficult for two white families to merge together and live together like that, two sets of strangers, worked out beautifully. Arlen became a member of our family. There were more of us than her, and she enjoyed being with us, and we loved her, still do.
Now, she was, I was surprised, she was relatively young, like in her early 20s at this point, right?
Right.
And I remember, I think in the book you described her as more like your older sister.
Right.
So that must have been a good thing then, that you had an older person that you could talk to that wasn't your mother.
Yes, right? Yes. I always, from that experience, I've always concluded that teenage girls need someone who's younger than their mother but older than they are to connect with. That it makes for a healthy opportunity.
So were you in middle school at that point?
Yes.
What was it like at the middle school for you when you started school there?
It was a very lonely kind of existence in comparison to my elementary school years in Alaska. I had for a few days one friend, and then I don't know what happened. In many cases, I think it was the parents that happened. But at any rate, we no longer were able to continue our friendship. So I didn't have people to talk to. I didn't have classmates as friends. Wasn't invited to birthday parties and things like that. On the other hand, in the neighborhood that we lived in, there was a family down the street who had a daughter whose parents did allow her to play with me, and so I had that to look forward to. It was easier on my sister in those years because as a young elementary school kid, I think she was in first grade, she was not seen by adults as a threat. And so she was able to go to parties and socialize and visit friends and have friends visit. However, for her, once she got to middle school, it all came to a halt. So I'm not sure which is best. I mean, in a sense, I learned to adjust to the fact that this would not be the source of my friendships. And so just kind of continued on with life, while my sister had the sense of betrayal when people that she thought were friends suddenly stopped having anything to do with her.
And it was because they felt more threatened by a teenager.
Right, right. Whereas, so I came in as a teenager, so the threat was already there, the perceived threat.
Yeah. And did your parents feel that same loneliness? Was it still a problem for them as well to connect with people socially in Delmar?
Well, it's not the kind of thing that parents would talk with their kids about. Looking back, as an adult, looking back on that period of time, I would say that my mother didn't have friends from Delmar, but she had the mobility to have friends from Albany and other places. So she didn't have the neighborly running in and out of each other's houses that existed for her in Alaska. But she did have Arlen, and they, of course, that was a lifelong friendship.
Now, how about as time went on? How about when you got to the high school? Did you begin to feel any more acceptance there, or did you always feel pretty much like an outsider?
I always felt like an outsider. What happened in high school is that I met a Jewish girl who was also an outsider. And we became friends in part because there weren't a lot of options. We shared a number of the same classes, so we became close friends. Would we have been friends if either of us had the choices that other kids had? It's hard to say. I don't know. But we were there for each other, and it meant that we could eat lunch with each other and not alone.
Now, I think probably one of the reasons your parents wanted to live in Delmar was because it had a pretty good school system.
Yeah.
Do you think you got a good education there? Did that part work for you?
That part worked for me, but I also believe that because my parents were educated and because education was important to them, they created a home environment and an environment with their associates that emphasized education. So I kind of feel whether I had gone to Bethlehem Central or not, I would have had a good foundation. And in fact, at a certain point, well, when I graduated from high school, my sister was beginning high school, and my parents asked me whether I thought it was more important to be in a community where you have friends and a social life, or whether it was more important to have a strong academic life. And I said, move. Move so my sister can have friends and activities and so on. Place that she would feel at home in.
So your parents moved twice, right? First they moved after their time with Arlen Westbrook ran out. That was only a 1-year lease, right? And then she was moving back into the house?
Well, what happened, her husband was, they were having a place built for them in Amherst. He was teaching at Amherst. So she was to join him, and which she did, and we continued to live in the house after she went to join him. But it was only a year program for him, so they came back. They were only wanted to rent for that year, and they came back, and so we had to find another place to live with the two of them coming back permanently. So we found a house still in Delmar, down the street on Borthwick Avenue.
Just around the corner from here.
Yeah. They found a house there with Arlen's help, and we moved there and stayed in touch and stayed good friends, because it really was just maybe a mile or so distance from our house to the Westbrooks' house. So we stayed in close touch.
And then, but eventually you moved out of Delmar so that your sister could go to a school where she was maybe more accepted?
Yeah. I went on to college, and so, that was kind of one kid down and one kid to go. And they, at that point, moved to Schenectady.
And how did she find the school there?
She found the school wonderful. She loved it. It was a racially mixed school, and she had friendships that were racially mixed. But the housing problem had not changed. My parents had to go through another ordeal in finding housing in Schenectady, and they were not welcome on the street that they moved into again, nor were they on Borthwick Avenue. So, but I think by the time they looked for housing in Schenectady, they kind of knew the drill. They knew what to expect. And part of they kind of made a commitment that we know how to do this now. We know how to open up neighborhoods, so to speak, in a good way. So we might as well continue to do that.
As I mentioned to you before the break, I didn't realize the extent of the housing discrimination. I knew about job discrimination. I knew, in fact, I think 20% of blacks were registered to vote in 1957. So I knew there were issues, but I had no idea how difficult the housing situation was.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are not aware of that. And may assume that there are a few blacks in a community because they simply can't afford to move there, when in reality it's that at that time in the 50s there were these protective covenants that were legal, that would enable real estate brokers to shut out families in order to keep the value of the property high. And there were all kinds of requirements of who could and couldn't live in a home. You could have a black person in the home as a servant, but not as a family member, and so on. So all of these restrictions eventually came to be changed, but it took struggle by blacks and by whites who agreed that blacks should be able to live wherever they chose. And not just blacks. Catholics were restricted from many communities. Jews were restricted. All kinds of restrictions. And it was commonplace at one time.
So did your dad was he discriminated against in terms of getting jobs? And he was a doctor. Did he have issues in terms of employment?
No, he was fortunate that the employment that he was first hired in the military as a physician on a military base. This was in Alaska. And there didn't seem to be any problem with sending him there. Opening a private practice in a white community, there might not have been much point in it, but for him, he was then working for the government, and when we returned to Albany, or when he got the job in Albany, again it was working for the government. And when he began his private practice, his clientele was a mixed clientele, but they were not residents of Delmar. He didn't open a private practice in Delmar.
Okay, you told me a little bit about your mom before we came in here, and that she's 96, and let's talk about her a little bit. She sounds like a wonderful person, and she's also an artist.
Yes.
And an educator.
Yes, she is. I seem to have followed in her footsteps in some ways. She's a wonderful writer. which is a plug for the book, because the parts that she wrote were riveting to me. I as a 12-year-old, I wasn't paying a lot of attention, and they didn't share a lot of what was going on at that time with me. So reading it in, as I read her journals was a real eye-opener for me. So she, but in addition to all of her talents, and she had so many talents, music, art, singing, her other passion was using the arts to make a better life for inner city kids, poor kids, black kids, and so on. And so she opened the Hamilton Hill Art Center, which was her baby. And recently I asked her what was she most proud of, and besides my sister and me, she named the Hamilton Hill Art Center as something that she was very proud of.
Oh, I would say that's a major accomplishment.
It really is. And she, she loved to write. So in addition to writing this book, or keeping the journal, she also wrote poetry. Her poetry was wonderful as well.
Okay. How about Arlen Westbrook? Would you like to talk a little bit about your friendship with her?
Yeah. Arlen was very different from the people I had known up till that point. Arlen was not a gushy, outward person. She's very quiet, restrained, but had a great sense of adventure, a great sense of exploration, of fairness, of right and wrong. She was, my mother in the privacy of the home was more effusive, but together they balanced each other in wonderful ways, and were forever taking on projects. Like maybe they decided to build a coffee table, and then they'd be at work on putting the coffee table together, or block printing drapes, or there was always a project going on with the two of them, which was wonderful. For me, I believed that I should be appreciative of what my parents tried to do for me, but I was not happy. So I felt I couldn't talk to my parents about my unhappiness, but I could be with Arlen and feel like someone understood me, and not even necessarily a lot of talk, but just doing things together. And in the doing, I would begin to feel like, there was someone who cared, who noticed, and so on.
Well, believe it or not, we're down to 5 minutes left. So there's so much more I'd like to ask you about. Let's talk a little bit about Black Lives Matter. What do you think about the Black Lives Matter movement?
I am so happy that the Black Lives Matter movement has come into being. As a child of the 60s, I was involved in the civil rights movement, and I kind of waited as I got older to see what was the next generation going to do. Were they going to take on this task? And it seems to have skipped a generation, in the sense that many people in the Black Lives Matter movement are young, are college students, and I think about, these are the people who are going to lead our country someday, and they have strong values and are willing to act on them, to bring about change, to risk their lives to do it, to risk their reputations among people who don't get it, don't understand. I think it's an excellent movement, and a perfect time for it to have come about. Yeah.
How much do you think things have changed in the town of Bethlehem?
That's an interesting question, because I think that it's still overwhelmingly white. I think there are more Asians living in this community than were when I lived here. But the number of blacks, although there's more than one family now, it's nowhere near what I would consider a balance.
No.
Not living here currently, I don't know what it feels like. But some people that I know who are black and live in Delmar have friendships with their neighbors, and their children have gone to Bethlehem Central and been, you know, one of several as opposed to the only one. So I think that in some ways it's improved in the sense that black people are not so foreign and feared as we once were, but in other ways the complexion of the community has not changed much.
Okay, we're just about out of time here. I'd like to talk one more minute about the book, because I think the book is so well written. It's a short book, but it's a wonderful book to read. It's available at several of the local libraries, including the Bethlehem Library, and I think it's an important story for people to know about. And well, I'd like to ask you, what do you want to leave us with? What do you think the most important thing is for people to learn about from the book, about what happened in Delmar in 1957 or 58? 57.
57,
Sorry.
yeah, that's okay. It was still happening in 58.
Yeah.
I think that it's important for people to know our history. If you don't know it, it could very easily happen with the other communities, other groups of people. So I think people should read it, because young people growing up today have no idea what it was like back then. So that's one reason that I think people need to know about it. I think the other part is that it shows how determined individuals can make change, can, by being who they are, by living their daily lives with a set of principles that enable them to set an example and make change.
Okay, well, we're out of time, and I think that's a perfect way to end it. So thank you very much for being here today, Miki.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you all for joining us. Please join us for future shows.
Bring them home, bring them home, bring our parents, our children home, from the dust of Afghanistan back to our arms, bring them home.
Bring them home, bring them home, bring our sons and our daughters home, from the ghettos of Baghdad back to our arms.